Bhagavan, the personality of Godhead. Swa Atma Mayaya, by his internal potency. Gatim, the end. Tam, that. Avalokya, foreseeing. Saha, he, Krishna. Saraswatim, the river Saraswati. Upasprishya, after sipping water. Vrikshamulam, at the foot of a tree. Upavishat, sat down. Translation. The personality of Godhead, Lord Sri Krishna, after seeing the end of his family by his internal potency, went to the bank of the river Saraswati, sipped water, and then sat down underneath a tree. The personality of Godhead, Lord Sri Krishna, after seeing the end of his family by his internal potency, went to the bank of the river Saraswati, sipped water, and sat down underneath a tree. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. All the above-mentioned activities of the Yadus and Bhojas were executed by the internal potency of the Lord, because he wanted them to be dispatched to their respective abodes after he had finished his mission of descent. They were all his sons and grandsons and were given complete protection by the paternal affection of the Lord. How they could be vanquished in the presence of the Lord is answered in this verse. Everything was done by the Lord himself, Swatma Mayaya. The Lord's family members were either incarnations of his plenary expansions or demigods from the heavenly planets. And thus, before his departure, he separated them by his internal potency. Before being dispatched to their respective abodes, they were sent to the holy place of Prabhash, where they performed pious activities and took food and drink to their heart's content. It was then arranged for them to be sent back to their abodes so that others could see that the powerful Yadu dynasty was no longer in the world. In the previous verse, the word anugyata, indicating that the whole sequence of events was arranged by the Lord, is significant. These particular pastimes of the Lord are not a manifestation of his external energy or material nature. Such an exhibition of his internal potency is eternal, and therefore one should not conclude that the Yadus and Bhojas died in a drunken state in an ordinary fratricidal war. Sri Jiva Goswami comments on these incidents as magical performances. I'll read that again. Sri Jiva Goswami comments on these incidents as magical performances. Bhagavan Swatma Mayaya Gatim Tam Avalokya Saha Saraswatim Upasprishya Viksha Mulam Upavishat. The personality of Godhead, Lord Sri Krishna, after foreseeing the end of his family by his internal potency, went to the bank of the river Saraswati, sipped water, and sat down underneath a tree. This thing. Umagyanati mirandasya gyananjana shalakaya chakshurun militam jena tasmai shri gurave namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Jena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Parakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savarutam Parichana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shivasakan Vitangscha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanda Radha Kanda Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Brindavaneshwari Brishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vansha Kalpa Turubhyascha Kripa Sindho Bevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prashtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Pasyacha Deshatarine Mukam Karoti Vachalam Pangum Langa Yateguru Jatkripa Tamaham Vande Shri Gurun Dinataranam. So this section of the Bhagavatam is talking about transition, the transition from Krishna's being active in the world to his leaving the world, or leaving the external vision of the world. Of course, we understand by his inconceivable potency, Krishna is omnipresent, eternally omnipresent. There's nothing that doesn't exist outside of the consciousness of the Lord. There's nothing outside of Krishna. But what we're dealing with here is his exit strategy from the world. It's a transitional period, and there's a very distinct connection between this part of the Bhagavatam and the 11th canto of the Bhagavatam. The first two cantos of the Bhagavatam basically set up the platform for the Bhagavatam to unfold. Many questions appear in the first two cantos of the Bhagavatam, beginning with the 6 questions of the sages at Naimisharanya, and then on from there, and especially in the second canto, when we get to the arrival of Sukadeva Goswami, and Parikshit Maharaj begins questioning him, and he asks him a lot of questions. And then Sukadeva begins answering those questions by referring to other situations in which similar questions and even more questions were asked. And that brings us into the third canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, and we're at this point in the history of the world where Vidura has been away from the affairs of the world for quite some time. He leaves the court of Duryodhana and Dhritarashtra prior to the battle of Kurukshetra, and then he goes on pilgrimage, and he meets Vidura. Vidura meets Uddhava. After Uddhava has been sitting with Krishna in what is called the Uddhava Gita, which appears in the 11th canto of the Bhagavatam. Uddhava meets Krishna sitting under this tree. And he hears from him, and Maitreya is nearby, also hearing. Not directly, but Krishna is speaking directly to Uddhava, but because of his particular qualifications, Maitreya is allowed to, as they say, audit that conversation. And then, knowing what's going to happen in terms of his departure, Krishna sends Uddhava to Bhadrika Ashram to associate there with Narayan and his devotees, while this final transition involving the destruction of the Yadu dynasty and Krishna's personal disappearance take place. And he's on the way to there when he meets Vidura. And then Vidura has all kinds of questions. And he wants Uddhava to be his spiritual master. But Uddhava, very politely on a principle of etiquette, he declines. He says, well, you're senior to me in age. You're old enough to be my father. So it would not be correct for me to become your spiritual master. So he refers him to Uddhava. Names, I get the names wrong. To Maitreya, who is an old man. So then we have this transition here, where Vidura transitions out of the association of Uddhava, and Uddhava goes on his journey to Badarik, and then we have, from then on, for a very large part of the Bhagavatam, we have Maitreya speaking to Vidura. The third canto and the 11th canto are very particular cantos of instruction. And actually, if you study Nectar of Devotion, you find most of the quotations from the Bhagavatam in the Nectar of Devotion come from the third canto teachings of Lord Kapila, or the 11th canto Uddhava Gita, Krishna's instructions to Uddhava on Bhakti Yoga. So this is where we're actually transitioning into the beginnings of the teachings of Bhagavatam also in this third canto. But as I say, they loop back, and they come from, in many instances, the 11th canto, because Maitreya is speaking to Vidura just after he's been in the presence of the Lord speaking to Uddhava. So there's a lot of crossover between those instructions, but they are very important instructions in that they deal with how to go very deep into bhakti, how to go very, very deep into bhakti yoga. They're the master class, really. But I thought what was probably more appropriate for us to talk about today, probably mainly because I'm not really qualified to talk about deep issues of bhakti, but the concept of transition is something that I think we're all concerned with. That's an interesting thing now. In my day, when a brahmachari moved into Grihastha ashram, it was called a fall down. But nowadays, quite appropriately, it's called a transition. I was just talking to one young American devotee the other day, and he was saying, "Yeah, I'm transitioning into Grihastha ashram." I thought, "Wow, good luck." I just said, "Good luck." No, the point I'm getting at is we are all in a process of transition. And it's very important to understand the sensitivities that exist when a person is in a stage of transition. Because transition really means I'm not here and I'm not there. As they say, I'm between the devil and the deep blue sea, or I'm between a rock and a hard place. The process of transition in any situation is a very, very sensitive one, and it's fraught with all kinds of vulnerabilities and pitfalls, dangers. So it's very important, therefore, that we become grounded in the actual practices that will enable us to make that transition successfully. It's like when you head out on a journey from one place to another, you think about, well, what am I going to need along the way, and what am I not going to need? What do I need to leave behind, and what do I need to take with me? And these things are very important. And in terms of the process of devotional service, there's a very nice description by Srila Rupa Goswami that Prabhupada quotes in the 10th verse of the 4th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. I was talking quite a bit about that verse last week. Does anyone know what that verse is? Remember that verse? Yeah, speak up. Vitaraga vaya krodha. It's a good one to remember, that phrase, because it's to do with transitioning. Being free from attachment, fear, and anger. What do we have to leave behind? We have to leave behind our attachment to matter. We have to leave behind the fear of our own spiritual identity. And we have to leave behind the anger that has arisen in us due to all of the kinds of frustrations that we've experienced in our contact with matter. I think I talked a bit about that as well last week, about the idea that oil and water don't mix. No matter what you try to do with oil and water, they won't mix. You can shake them, stir them, whatever, and all that happens is that you get a very much more dissipated situation. You put a drop of oil in some water and stir the water, you may break up that one drop of oil, but it just becomes many drops of oil. So we're very entangled in the material world. That's a given. We need to understand the phase of attachment to matter itself is very deep and very, very broad, and we are very entangled in that situation. But there's a process. There's a process by which we come out of it, and that's the verses that I quoted here, again from Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Nectar of Devotion. In Nectar of Devotion, as well as the quotes from the Shastra, you have these amazing philosophical, it's an extended philosophical dissertation by Rupa Goswami himself, what he says. And he says here, in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Canto 1, Chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, fully quoted here in the purport to Bhagavad Gita 4.10, and I draw your attention to this. It's very important what Prabhupada says, what the translation of these verses are and what Srila Prabhupada says about them, in order for us to keep our bearings in this process of transition from being totally entangled in the material world to leaving the material world behind. And as the saying goes, and not look back. One of the biggest dangers in setting off on journeys and going somewhere else is what is called homesickness. It comes nostalgia. The Greek word, it comes from a Greek word, nostalgia, which actually it's a description of a certain kind of pain Nostalgia is a pain. It's a pain for what is familiar that is no longer there, or we are no longer with. I mean, this is a big thing in so many people's lives, where all of our lives actually, because we're locked towards the future. We're on a journey in time, whether we like it or not, and we have to leave everything behind, whether we like it or not. Whether we remain materially attached or whether we become completely detached. The principle is, as time passes, you've got to leave it behind. And as long as one remains attached to what one is leaving behind, then there'll be difficulties with that. And those difficulties are called anattas. Unwanted things that are there within our hearts. Anatta. Anatta also, atta means auspicious, of value. Anatta means useless things, inauspicious things, dirty things. And so the process described here is very nice. Adau, meaning in the beginning, Adau, Shraddha, then Tata Sadhu Sangha, then Atta Bhajana Kriya, Tato Nato Nivritti Shyat, Tato Nishta Ruchishtata, Atta Shaktis Tato Bhavas, Tata Preman Bhudanchani, that word's hard, Prema Bhudanchati, Sadhakanam Ayam Premna Prabhurve Bhavet Krama. And the translation is, in the beginning, one must have a preliminary desire for self-realization. Now, I just wanted to say a little bit more about that in terms of another point that I was making last week about the word should. I think I should actually say something about this. When we come to devotional service, well, first of all, there's this desire, but then through the association of sadhu sangha, devotees of the Lord, then bhajana kriya, we enter into the process called bhajana kriya, and that's where all the shoulds and should nots come up. But we need to see these things from a point of view that actually we are independent living entities. We are always independent. But we give up our independence and come under the influence of the material energy. And then you enter into all this discussion in philosophy about, is there free will or is everything determined? And there's a total misunderstanding there, or total lack of knowledge there of how the material energy works and how we are not material, and how there's that incompatible linkage between us and matter. But actually we are independent, always. And that has to be borne in mind, because just like in Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna surrenders to Krishna in his confusion and his perplexity and his weakness. And then Krishna speaks Bhagavad Gita. But then at the end, Krishna says, so now I've said everything, you consider these things and you do whatever you like. There's one very nice lecture in what's called the Bhagavad Dharma lectures. The lecture Srila Prabhupada gave on verses from the second chapter of the Bhagavatam, Savai Pungsam Parodamo verse, in which Prabhupada is talking about this situation and how Krishna says to Arjuna, you can do whatever you like. And then he says, that you can do whatever you like is always there. You can do whatever you like. But you have to understand the consequences of your actions. What one thing leads to. One thing leads to another. But you are free to do whatever you like. That has to be borne in mind when we come to the question of you should do this and you shouldn't do that. Because it comes down to a question of desire. What do you want? Like, if you want to become an Olympic athlete, right, then if I want to become an Olympic athlete, then there's all kinds of things I must do, and there's all kinds of things I must not do. Now, what's the point of putting myself in a situation of, oh, I must do this and I must not do that, if I don't want something? If I don't want it, why put myself through it? I learned that one pretty early in high school, when they really started getting serious about training for sport. You had to be there at this time, you had to eat this, you had to do that. And I'm like, why? Why do I have to do all that? Well, if you want to get on the team, well, I don't want to be on that team. So I walked away. I didn't do those things. Didn't want to. So therefore, as it says here, Ado Shraddha, in the beginning, there must be a preliminary desire for self-realization. And that's a very important point to understand also about this journey, this transition that we're on. Because why are we here? And how do we come to be here? How do we come to be here? Ishvara savabhutanam riddeshatyuna tishtati. Krishna has brought us here. Krishna has brought us to this situation because we have a desire. And we have a desire and many of us, we come to this after having to just work our way through so many unsatisfactory, incomplete propositions of what is the purpose of life. But here, we've been brought here by the direction of the Lord. The Lord is directing our wanderings, and He's brought us here because our desire is not superficial. It's a deep desire. There's a deep desire within the heart of every one of you to know the truth. What is the truth? What does it all add up to? What is it all for? What am I for? That's a big one. What about me? What am I in all of this? What is my position in all of this? I want to know this. So that desire is there. Hare Krishna. So there's this preliminary desire, but there's no knowledge. I'm born in ignorance. And just think of the ignorance of the human situation when you're born. You can't talk, you can't walk, you can't, all you can do is basically scream your lungs out. And that's because you're feeling some pain, but you can't communicate that to anyone, and you're totally helpless. A little, you go up the farm and you watch a calf being born. This little thing drops out on the ground, and the mother licks it clean, and then within a few minutes it's standing up. How long does it take for you to get on your feet? And you're helpless. You're totally helpless and totally in ignorance. It's like, when somebody is in a shocking accident and they're in a coma and they come out of the coma and they can't even talk anymore. So people get so battered in situations like that. Basically, that's like dying and being born. The trauma that we go through by being in the womb and taking birth. In the womb, we see again. In the womb, we see the Lord. We all see the Lord in the womb. And our prayer is, get me out of this, and I will serve you forever. Get me out of this misery. and I'm yours. But we're in there because of our material attachment, and we have to go through this process called birth, and as soon as we come out of that birth, we're surrounded by people who are totally bewildered about who they are and what we are, and then all this false imposition of who we are is put upon us, and we're lost. But we are those fortunate souls, and there are not many in the creation at any given time, who are not satisfied with what's happening to them as they go through life. And my experience, when you get down and you hear devotees' stories, and there's a common thread. There's a common thread through through all devotee stories, that they feel out of place from as soon as they're aware of where they are. Who are these people? What is this? Why am I here? That feeling is there. And there's no answers, no satisfactory answers. I remember I used to ask my mother when I was a little boy, why this, why that, why the other? And she would get so fed up with me. Why, Mummy, why? And she'd turn around and she'd say, because why is a crooked letter and you can never make it straight. Rather than say, I don't know, I don't know. Mummy knows best. And there you are, trapped in that situation. You're with ignorant people who, as the saying goes, they're trying to hide what they don't know to begin with. They are pretending to hide from you something that they know that they don't know. It's all bluff. It's all bluff. And then you go to school. Oh my. That Prabhupada says the slaughterhouse of education. There's a very powerful paragraph about ahimsa in the 10th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna lists in verses 5 and 6, he lists a number of things. Where are we? We're in the 10th chapter. Is it 5 and 6? 4 and 5, sorry. He says, intelligence, knowledge, freedom from doubt and delusion, forgiveness, truthfulness, control of the senses, control of the mind, happiness and distress, birth, death, fear, fearlessness, non-violence, equanimity, satisfaction, austerity, charity, fame and infamy. All these various qualities of living beings are created by me alone. Now, in regard to ahimsa, non-violence, Prabhupada gives a purport to that, a paragraph to that. Ahimsa, non-violence, means that one should not do anything which will put others into misery or confusion. There's so much confusion. There's so much confusion in our minds about what is the purpose of life. What am I doing here? What am I supposed to do? Like there was a thing going around at the Manor with the youth group one few years ago where they had this quote from John Lennon. He was in the Beatles, if you... John Lennon it said he was asked in school, what do you want to be when you grow up, John? He said, I want to be happy. And then later on he wrote a song called Working Class Hero, and in that song he said, they beat you and scare you for 20 odd years, and then they expect you to pick a career. But you can't really function, you're so full of fear. Does it ring true? Yes? And then there's well, while we're on it, there's a Bob Dylan song where he says, 20 years of schooling and they put you on the day shift. Look out, kid. Look out. We go through this school this schooling, which gives us no education. Education, eduque, means to lead out. And education is meant to lead you out of ignorance. Lead you out of ignorance into the light of knowledge. But we get schooled how to become, as the song goes, another brick in the wall. All in all, you're just another brick in the wall after you come out of all of that. Because that's all you've been trained to be. It's just another brick in somebody else's wall. So look out, kid. Look out. And we were all actually looking out. Somehow or another, we weren't satisfied. Because this deeper desire is there. This deeper desire for self-realization. Not even really knowing that's what it is. We're so much in ignorance, we don't even know that this desire that we have is for self-realization. And therefore we don't know that this desire for self-realization is really the desire to know God and what is my relationship with Him. Because that is the true position of the self. To be in one's eternal relationship with God. That's what we're meant for. To be in an eternal, loving relationship with Krishna. So, reading on here. Non-violence means that one should not do anything which will put others into misery or confusion. Material activities that are promised by so many politicians, sociologists, philanthropists, and so on, do not produce very good results because the politicians and philanthropists have no transcendental vision. They do not know what is actually beneficial for human society. Ahimsa means that people should be trained in such a way that the full utilization of the human body can be achieved. The human body is meant for spiritual realization. So any movement or any commissions which do not further that end commit violence on the human body. That which furthers the future spiritual happiness of the people in general is called non-violence. So, this is what we've been through. Let's be clear. We've been through a very violent situation. We live in a very violent world. Actually, jivasya jivanam, jivo jivasya jivanam. In this world, the strong prey on the weak, and one living being, in one way or another, is food for another. And that's the way of the world. There's another line from a very popular song that says, democracy don't rule this world. You better get that through your head. This world is ruled by violence. But I guess that's better left unsaid. And it is left unsaid. But when it comes down to it, this world is ruled by violence. This world is all about violence. So we've been through that. Again, as the saying goes, you and I, we've been through that. And we wanted something else. We had this preliminary desire for self-realization. It's a preliminary desire. That's a very important point because it's inchoate. It's vague. It's not really clear what it is. There's something. There's something. And that's super soul. Super soul prompting you. Super soul is prompting you. Reawakening desires that have been there in you, maybe for many lifetimes. Maybe for many, many lifetimes. But every time we transition from one body to another, we lose awareness of all these things. And then when we come into the new life, then Super Soul prompts us. This is what you wanted. This is what you wanted. This is what you wanted. The trouble is, because of our attachment to the material world, we have a lot of unwanted desires. So it's all mixed in. there's a desire for self-realization, but we're also wired by our conditioning to desire so many material things as well. So therefore, it's very important that we become fixed in bhajana kriya, in the actions of bhajana kriya very early in life, and especially very early in our devotional life. And the basis of that is what we hear. What we become accustomed to hearing. And then people will say, oh, well, you Hare Krishnas, you're just brainwashed. Well, Prabhupada used to say, yes, we are washing your brain because it is full of stool. Prabhupada didn't beat around the bush. Your brain is filthy. We have to wash it. Our brains are dirty. Our minds are dirty. Dirty with anarthas. Dirty as a result of our contact with the material energy. There's a quote in Govinda's restaurant about cleanliness from Prabhupada. He says, if you're dirty, you're in the material world. Cleanliness is next to godliness. If you're dirty, you're in the material world. There's a lovely description later on here in this third canto where Lord Brahma has a vision of Vaikuntha. And he sees the Lakshmis are dusting everything, but there's no dust. They're going around with their dusters dusting things, but there's no dust. There's no dirt. All this dirt comes from contact with matter. When Prabhupada acquired Bhaktivedanta Manna, Shyam Sundar, you can read it in the conversation books around that time, actually fantastic lectures, July, August 1973. Prabhupada starts lecturing from the first verse of the Gita all the way through, practically halfway through the second chapter. Fabulous lectures on those verses. But alongside of that, in the conversations, you find that Prabhupada's talking to all kinds of people in his rooms. Shyam Sundar used to go and bring people to Prabhupada. And there was a man famous at that time. He wrote a book called Small is Beautiful. His name was Schumacher. He was one of the first people drawing people's attention to the pollution problems in the world and the problem with the environment. And so Shyama Sundar got him to come and see Prabhupada. And just before he left, Schumacher gave Shyama Sundar an essay. He said, this is an essay, Hare Krishna. Shri Shri Radha Gopinath ki jai. Shri Baladev, Jagannath Baladev Subhadra ki jai. Shri Shri Gaunitai ki jai. He said, this is an essay that I've written giving my recommendations about how we can deal with the pollution problems in the world. Give it to your guru to read, and then we can discuss. So Shyam Sundar read it, and then he told Prabhupada this man was coming, and he gave me this essay to read, and he wanted you to read it. And Prabhupada said, should I read it? Shyam Sundar said, nah, you don't need to read it. But he wants to talk about the pollution problem. And Prabhupada said, oh, okay. So this man came, and he was all, metrics. There's so much this, there's so much that, we have to do this, we have to do that. Prabhupada listened to him for a while, and then he said, unless you purify the consciousness, unless you take the pollution out of the consciousness, you will never solve the external pollution problem, because this is all arising out of your polluted consciousness, out of a total misunderstanding of what this world is about, what it is for, and what the human form of life is for. And the human form of life is actually meant for a transition. It's the lifetime, and specifically the human form of life on this planet is meant for transitioning out of the material world. Otherwise, it's a useless waste of time. It's a useless waste of time. Because anything you do in this lifetime which is not for that purpose simply entangles you further and further into the repetition of birth and death, which is your fundamental problem. Our fundamental problem is that we've become entangled in the repetition of birth, death, disease, and old age. And in the 13th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna lists in verses 8 to 12, he lists many points that he says these things constitute knowledge. And one of those points is Janma, Mrityu, Jara, Vyadi, Dukkha, Doshano, Dashano. One must see the evil nature of this process of being entangled in the repetition of birth, death, disease, and old age. So we're in a process of transition, whether we like it or not. We're either going to transition from this lifetime back into the wheel of samsara, or we're going to transition out of this material world. The difficulty in the age that we are living in is that the knowledge of how to transition out of this world is practically lost. I mean, the other week, if those of you, when Devanrita Maharaj was talking at the Bhakti House, at the end of his talk, Apurva Madhuri asked, what he was talking about bhakti and how to practice bhakti and how to come out of one's entanglement in the material world. And she asked, what role does grace play in all of this? He gave a very interesting answer. He said, actually, it's all grace. Because what's happening here now, strictly speaking, according to Kali Yuga, this should not be happening. This should not be happening. The only reason it is happening is because there's been an intervention by the Lord into this world. Intervention is a very important thing because anattas bind us endlessly in the material world. It is said nitya baddha. There's a big philosophical debate always going on about what does nitya mean in the nitya baddha, because Prabhupada says you're either nitya siddha or you're nitya baddha. And the meaning of nitya, well, there are many shades of meaning of nitya, but it means eternally. But it also means for a very long time, not necessarily eternally, I mean all the time, bound up in time. So by our karma, we're bound up in the material world for an inconceivable amount of time into the future. And the nature of the material world is, as Krishna says, Deva Yesha Gunamayi Mama Maya Duratyaya. You can't overcome it. Once you enter the material world, one of the stipulations for entering the material world is that you forget who you are. And in the process, and as I've said before, we know ourselves by our relationships. We define who we are by the relationships we're in. Now, the reason that is there is because it's a perverted reflection into the miserable temporary world of what is actually in the spiritual world. Everyone's identity is defined by their relationship with Krishna. So if you forget yourself, you must also forget Krishna, and you must forget your relationship with Krishna. So entering the material world means that. Off the bat. Let's kick it off with that. Total annihilation of all memory of everything that went before. And no means, material means by which you can recall that. Because the second half of the verse says, Mameva ye prapadyante mayamitang tarantite. But those who surrender unto me can very easily cross beyond the influence of matter. And this is such a key point of understanding, that it's like there's all these films around. You see something called Maze Runner, where these people have to deal with this maze, and they have to go in and they have to find the way out. And the problem is, with mazes, once you're in, is you can't get out, actually. You can't get out. I remember when I was a little boy, we used to go to the Adelaide show, and when in the sideshows they had the Hall of Mirrors, where you'd go into this totally black space, and there were mirrors. And you would go down this corridor with black curtains all over you, and you'd think, oh, there's a way out there. And then you go there, and then boom, you're looking at yourself in a mirror. And then you start to get a little panicky, because you're in total darkness. But there's somehow light being reflected in that darkness, which gives the appearance of a way out. And after a while, people start to really freak out. And there's people who know that, who set that thing up. They know how it's all set up, and they can come in. And people would be hysterical, screaming, "Get me out of here! Get me out!" And then this person would have to come in and bring them out. It's actually an interesting analogy for life in the material world. Get me out of here! Yeah? Then, as the song goes, there must be some way out of here. But I can't find it. And that's the nature of the material world. It's like the invisible doors slide open, you step in, the invisible doors close, you turn around, and there's a blank wall. And then you turn around again. Oh no, actually, this doesn't look too bad. What's that over there? And then you're gone. Then you're gone. You're hooked. And then it's Devi Yesha Gunamai. You're in the hands of the three modes of material nature. Which is what we wanted. We wanted pleasure at the hands of the three modes of material nature, with this forgetfulness of Krishna and how he's the enjoyer and we're his servants. We wanted to forget all that, so we got it. Krishna satisfied our desire. But we're hopelessly lost in this material world, but we're always transitioning. We're always having to transition out of the situation that we're in into something that we don't know. We don't know. We're always faced with the unknown in the material world. You don't know. Like this, you just don't know what's around the corner. But you have to go around the corner and get hit by that bus that's steaming down the road. It has to happen because you're entangled now in all this karma, all these consequences of material action and reaction. But it's a slow process that we're talking about here. First of all, there must be the preliminary desire for self-realization. This will bring one to the stage of trying to associate with persons who are spiritually elevated. As I said, this shouldn't be happening in the Kali Yuga. This is all shut off. This doesn't happen in Kali Yuga. The only reason it is happening is because there's been an intervention. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has intervened and given us this very simple process of Sankirtan Yajna, which is rooted in the process of hearing and chanting. Hearing and chanting about the Lord, hearing and chanting what the Lord says, hearing and chanting about what is said about the Lord, and so on. But in the next stage, one becomes initiated by an elevated spiritual master, and under his instruction, the neophyte devotee begins the process of devotional service. And then later on, Prabhupada says, so, by the slow process of devotional service, under the guidance of the bona fide spiritual master, one can attain the highest stage, being freed from all material attachment, from all fearfulness of one's individual spiritual personality, and from the frustrations that result in void philosophy. Then one can ultimately attain to the abode of the Supreme Lord. The slow process, the gradual and proportionate process. Therefore, Nectar of Instruction, again by Rupa Goswami, tells us there must first of all be enthusiasm. Then there must be determination in the face of all these anarthas, all of these distractions that continually go on, because we're still in the material world. And then there must be patience, because it is an organic and slow process. It's what the human form of life is meant for, the whole of a life. And I said this once here before, it's good to be a gardener. And Lord Chaitanya talks about gardening in his instructions to Rupa Goswami. We're really into Rupa Goswami this morning. But in his instructions to Rupa Goswami, he talks about the seed, the bhakti lata, the seed of devotional service. That is the rules and the regulations and the principles and the practices of devotional service. This is the seed of bhakti. But you have to want it. That's just the point. If you want it, then you must do this and you must not do that. This is bhajana kriya. One must enter seriously into bhajana kriya. But then anatta nivritti. Then all the unwanted desires become like harpies. Well, what about me? What about me? What about this? What about... Didn't you want this? Didn't you want that? You know you want this. You know you want it. Go on. And then anatta nivritti means you have to, on the one hand, there's the idea that you have to pull the weeds out. Because the watering process of hearing and chanting not only nourishes the creeper of bhakti, but it also awakens the seeds, the dormant seeds that are in your heart for jnana and karma. And if you're not careful, you've got to be very careful here, because these weeds imitate the bhakti creeper. So it's just like in the early days when Prabhupada came to England after the first time after he'd installed Radha Londonishwara, he came back to England some months later, and devotees had been cultivating tulsi in a room upstairs in Berry Place, and they had this big tulsi plant, and they were like really proud of this. So they brought Prabhupada and said, Prabhupada, we're growing tulsi. And Prabhupada said, oh, very nice. He said, come and see. So they took him to the room, they opened the door, and he looked in, he said, that is basil. Looks like tulsi. Looks like tulsi. So, there's another approach to this. The watering process of hearing and chanting will stimulate the growth of unwanted things as well as the growth of wanted things. So, the idea of the rice